Dick Gregory died over the weekend, as did Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis I didn't know. Jerry Lewis was part of everybody's growing up, if nothing else, with the muscular dystrophy telethons. But Dick Gregory was a big part of my growing up. And just an amazing guy. Back in 1960, I think it was 68, I had a job as the all-night DJ at a radio station in Lansing, Michigan. And I did an all-night progressive rock show. And I was 17 years old. I was doing an all-night progressive rock show. And the station during the daytime played what was called the Drake format, which was a guy named Bill Drake came up with this out of, I think, CKLW or one of the big stations anyway. And rock and roll stations. It was a rock and roll format. The top of the hour, go top 10, and then go to the golden oldies, and then you go to the top 50, and then you go to and we had different bins, and we would just rotate the records from the bins from front to back and everything. And there were rules around the Drake format, but I didn't do a rock and roll show. I did a album cut show all night. So I didn't, pay much attention to them, didn't bother to learn them. And one night I was doing my show, and I played two Motown artists back to back, two women who were black. And it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and the station manager, I never got clear whether he was the owner or the manager, but he might have been both. His name was Bob. He called me up and started yelling at me about, what, are you trying to create a sound on my station? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you just played two black women back to back. You don't do that. It breaks the rules of the Drake format. And I said, I'm doing a progressive rock show. I'm doing album cuts. I mean, this isn't, rock and roll. And he just went off on me. He's like, you're not going to do that. And I said, wait a minute, you're upset because I played two black women back to back? And he's like, yes. So I hung up on him. And I started playing black women. I was a little more oppositional when I was 17. I guess I'm pretty oppositional right now. And so he calls back and he's screaming at me. He's screaming obscenities at me. He's like, you're fired. He is what he ended with. This was all he had, right? And I said, okay, thank you very much. And I hung up and I got out Dick Gregory's album, The Light Side, The Dark Side, which had just come out, as I recall, just prior to that. I had listened to it with a bunch of friends, in the previous month or three. I'd never met Dick Gregory. I'd never seen him, anything, but his work was just, I was just a white kid in Lansing, Michigan, right? But it's just amazing work. And I played all four sides of that album. It took about an hour or 2 hours, something like that. I played it over and over all night long. And I found some other Dick Gregory to play. And I basically played Dick Gregory and Motown for the rest of the night. And that was my last night at that radio station. And in fact, after about an hour of this, the engineer, who was a really nice guy and a good friend of mine, we were both ham radio operators. And he was just a couple years older than me. He was a student, an engineering student, a grad student at MSU. He shows up at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And he says, Bob called me and told me I'm supposed to come here and throw you out of the studio and just play music all night. And I said, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not going to get in a fight with you or anything. It's like the guy was a friend of mine. And he says, well, I don't really want to do that. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he pulls a bag of pot out of his pocket and says, let's get high. And so we sat there in the studio smoking dope for the rest of the night. Keep in mind, this was 1968. And that was the end of that. The one and only time in my entire life that I've been fired with cause. But that was the first impact Dick Gregory had on me. Then years later, we started this vegetarian community for abused kids in New Hampshire, and I knew that Dick Gregory was a vegetarian. I'd read his book, Dick Gregory's Diet. Oh, what was it called? Something like Dick Gregory's Cooking with Life or whatever it was. In any case, I'd read his stuff, and so and I was looking for famous vegetarians. Dennis Weaver had joined our board. Gloria Swanson had joined our board. So I contacted, I had a mutual friend, and I contacted Dick Gregory, and he came up to New Hampshire to visit our place. He spent several days with us. He then, a little later that year, he became a member of our board. And later that year, he and I went to Germany to visit the Solemn headquarters that I will be visiting next month, actually, it's the anniversary. And then we flew down to Nairobi, and then we picked up a plane to Uganda, to Entebbe. And we spent a week in Uganda looking at the famine relief programs in the wake of Idi Amin's ouster. This was 1981. That the Salem organization, SalemInternational.org is the website that Salem was running, and got to know each other really well. The guy had just a nonstop sense of humor. I mean, it was just traveling with him, getting to know him, working with him was such a privilege in my life. And his nonstop sense of humor. I remember, we were going through the airport in, as I recall, I think it was Nairobi. It might have been Entebbe. Anyhow, we were going through an airport. We were walking down this hall, and I was the only white face that could be seen anywhere. And I was carrying the bags. And he turns to me, he goes, "You hurry up, white boy, come on." Like that. "Pick up my bag." And it was just so funny. It was like this nonstop. I mean, that you could think of that as funny or not. I mean, whatever. But one thing Dick Gregory was politically correct. He was brilliant. And this is, he was on the Merv Griffin show, as I recall. Nate, this is Merv Griffin, right? Yeah, Merv Griffin show in 1965. And he's making the point that when you've got 20 million African Americans telling you that you've got a police brutality problem, you should pay attention to them. This was 42 years ago, on a program that was watched by a massive chunk of white America, and nobody was paying attention. Here is Dick Gregory from the Merv Griffin show back in the day. Just a short clip here.
Every incident that had been tipped off in this country in the last 2 years up north have been tipped off by uniformed police. Now, I'm not saying the police is right or wrong. I'm saying when you have these incidents that's tipped off with this one symbol, then we should look into it and see what it is. When 22 million people, be they black or white, start hollering police brutality, then it's time to start listening to 22 million people and going in. A lot of people say, well, it's not police brutality. Police brutality is not when a cop necessarily knocks me upside the head. It's when a cop calls me nigger when he's making the arrest. It's when he handles me wrongly in every process of processing the arrest. This is a form of police brutality. And there's so few people that seem to understand that when the Negro says it's police brutality, then you say, well, he's just looking for a way out. Well, how do these many people look for a way out in so many areas in America? It's like Billy Graham, I think, made the statement of statements when he came into L.A., and he said he thought the communists was behind the riots. And there's just not enough communists in Russia to stand on every corner in a Negro ghetto waiting for a cop to arrest a Negro and start a riot.
And there he goes, using humor to awaken us. I miss Dick Gregory.